begin. Verse 1, David asked, "Is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" And there was a servant of Saul's household named Ziba, and they summoned him to appear before David. And the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" "At your service," he replied. And the king asked, "Is there no one still alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness?" Now, the year was 982 BC. David had been king in Israel, in Jerusalem, for about 5 years. And one of the first questions that he asks in this newly formed kingship is there anyone left of Saul's house that I can show kindness towards? Now, I want to pause there for a sec because right off the bat, this raises all kinds of questions. Is there anyone left of Saul's house? Well, who was Saul? Saul was David's enemy. Saul hated David. He was jealous of David. Saul tried to have David killed. Remember the story we looked at a month ago where David, part of his job, he's a musician, he's a poet, he's a worship leader, and he would serenade Saul, basically. He'd go into the palace and play music on his harp and fill the palace with music. They didn't have Spotify back then, they had David. And so David's playing, and Saul just has this moment of jealousy towards David, and it says he grabbed a spear and he threw it at David. He's trying to kill him, and David, of course, has to run. He gets the point, so to speak, and he runs away for 10 years. Now, it's a fascinating story. Could you imagine having working conditions like that? Some of you are like, "Yeah, it sounds like my boss." You show up at work tomorrow and you look over the cubicle. "Oh, I see you brought a crossbow. What a blessing." So David realizes, "I'm not safe. I need to go." For 10 years, he's on the run. He's living in caves. He's disguising himself. He's trying to rescue and be saved and preserved from Saul. And Saul continually tried to kill him. Finally, Saul is killed in battle. Jonathan, his son, was killed in battle too. More on that later. David becomes king 5 years into his reign. He then says, "Is there anyone of Saul's house that I can bless? Is there anyone that I can show kindness towards?" That is not how I would write the story. If I were David, and I'm writing 2 Samuel chapter 9, and I just gone through all that with King Saul and just been harassed and almost killed, I would probably say, "Is there anyone left of the house of Saul that I could take revenge on," right? Let's kind of release a few emails or hashtag never Saul or something. But I would never, ever say, at least in my flesh, "Hey, I want to show kindness." So David is doing something here that's striking. It's unusual. It's counterintuitive. It cuts against the grain. Now let's keep reading. Verse 3, Ziba answered the king, "There is still a son of Jonathan, and he is lame in both feet." "Where is he?" the king asked. And Ziba answered, "He is at the house of Machir, son of Ammiel, in Lo-debar." And King David had him brought from Lo-debar, from the house of Machir, son of Ammiel. And when Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honor. And David said, "Mephibosheth, at your service," he replied. This is a story about a guy named Mephibosheth. And for those of you who are pregnant this afternoon and you're looking for a name, here's something to pray about. Mephibosheth. Now, Mephibosheth's story, it goes all the way back to 2 Samuel chapter 4, and it's a tragic story, actually. Mephibosheth is quite a bit younger than King David, and Saul is killed in battle, and Mephibosheth, who was the grandson of Saul, was being cared for by a nanny, a nurse. She hears the news, "Oh no, Saul, his grandpa, is dead. So maybe this means for Mephibosheth that his life is in danger. So I have to preserve him. I have to help him." And it says that she picked him up in her arms and she runs. She tries to find a place of safety for Mephibosheth. But as she's running, she trips, she falls, and something happened. Maybe his legs broke or got crushed. Something happened, and from that day on, Mephibosheth, it says, was crippled in both of his legs. He couldn't walk. Now, I want to pause there for a second because this is absolutely fundamental to our story and our understanding of what's happening culturally. In those days, in the ancient world, having a medical condition like this or being disabled was huge because it meant that you would be the object of active discrimination. There are very little opportunities for you, whether it's employment or marriage. You would be pushed to the fringes of society. In fact, I was reading about the Sumerian cultures and the Mesopotamian cultures, and a few years ago, when I lived in England, I actually had a chance as part of my research to look at these old clay tablets. They found thousands and thousands of tablets from the Mesopotamian era. And this is part of the culture that was surrounding Israel at that time. And you read through some of these tablets and you do the translation work, and what you discover is that this culture, a part of how they viewed people, especially those who had any kind of disability, is that they thought that this was a sign of the anger and the judgment of the gods. In fact, there's this ancient Sumerian tablet, and it tells this myth of Enki and Nimrod. And in the myth, it actually says, if a girl or boy is crippled, quote, the land will be disturbed and the house will suffer. So someone like Mephibosheth in Sumerian cultures wouldn't stand a chance. People would discriminate against him. He would live in isolation. He would live in fear. And he would be destined to a life of constant harassment from others. They thought that he would have been cursed. Now, when I first graduated high school a year and a half ago, no, I'm kidding. When I graduated high school, I spent a year in a third world country at an orphanage caring for disabled children. And it was an amazing year, one of the best years of my life. Super hard, but really rich and really beautiful. And the Lord just showed me so much through these kids. And I was there with a team just volunteering this year. And these are kids with extreme disabilities, and you begin to hear their story, and it was so heartbreaking. Stories of abuse and neglect, stories where the families were so ashamed of them, they just kind of locked them away, many cases for years and years on end. Many of them had literally just been abandoned or thrown out onto the streets, and so they ended up at this orphanage. There were about 30 kids or so. And part of our job was not just to care for them physically, but the more challenging part was the emotional side, because they came with all these wounds and the struggle of security and insecurity. And part of our role was to show them how much they are loved and valued. And this was huge, that they are safe, that this is a safe space. They're not going to be abandoned. They're not going to be thrown out. And for many, many years, thousands of years culturally, that was actually not just extreme examples, that was the norm. And for the cultures surrounding Israel, that was the way that they did things. So you got to understand, Mephibosheth, he's living in constant fear and harassment. He's living in a place that was very isolated. Notice verse 4, it says he lived in Lo-Debar. Now, you think, I've never heard of Lo-Debar. Well, there's a reason. It's one of these really remote, isolated, small communities. In fact, if you're taking notes, the word Lo-Debar literally means without pasture. Without pasture. To an agrarian economy, that was huge. This meant that the majority of people who were living there were extremely poor. It's out in the middle of nowhere. Now, in our own nation, we have some towns that are kind of in the middle of nowhere. As I mentioned last week for our vacation, we drove from North Carolina and visited our sister church there, and we drove all the way back to Portland. We thought it would be a fun thing to do to see different parts of the country. And one of the unique things is you not only see some beautiful places, but some very, very remote places and towns that just, there's not a whole lot going on. We saw towns of population 14 on the sign or whatever, and it's like a gas station, a post office, and that's it. And some of the names of these towns, this was the classic part. I began to write down some of the names of these towns that we saw, and I don't know who thinks of these, but they're absolutely brilliant. So here's one. This is in Nebraska, Hazard, Nebraska. There's a few Dukes that live there, I hear. Here's another one, Fertile. It's called Fertile, Iowa. This one's amazing. Frankenstein, Missouri. Frankenstein. This is one of my favorite. Tightwad, Missouri. They all seem to be Missouri. Here's one. This one's so good. Nothing, Arizona. It's literally called Nothing. Aptly named, by the way, because there's not a whole lot going on. Someone came up to me after the last gathering. They're like, Dom, you forgot Boring, Oregon. And then here's one in Wisconsin. It's one word, I'm alone. I'm alone in Wisconsin. A lot of single people there. And my favorite of all, this is true, there's a town called Hell, Michigan. Hell. Where are you from? Hell. No. Seriously, where are you from? I'm from Hell. So someone brilliantly wrote, when you drive into Hell, I just love saying, there's a sign that says the road to hell is paved with good intentions and lots of potholes. It's true, there's a ton of potholes there. So it's amazing, you go through our own nation and you see these kind of obscure Hicksville towns or whatever. Think of Lodabar in that way. This was so remote, in the middle of nowhere, and that's where Mephibosheth was. Why? Because he wanted to live in isolation because of the kind of discrimination that he would receive, because how he was viewed culturally. So David sends his men to Lodabar. Go bring Mephibosheth to me. I want to have a conversation with him. He's the grandson of Saul, and so I want to see him for myself. And they go and they get Mephibosheth, verse 7, and they have a conversation. Check this out. Don't be afraid, David said to him, for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. And I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table. Mephibosheth bowed down, and he said, what is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me? And the king summoned Ziba, Saul's steward, and said to him, I have given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. You and your sons and your servants are to farm the land for him and bring in the crops so that your master's grandson may be provided for. And Mephibosheth, grandson of your master, will always eat at my table. Now check this out. It says, now Ziba had 15 sons, and 20 servants, and a huge tax write-off. And Ziba said to the king, your servant will do whatever my lord the king commands his servant to do. So Mephibosheth ate at David's tables like one of the king's sons. And Mephibosheth had a young son named Micah. And all the members of Ziba's household were servants of Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem because he always ate at the king's table, and he was lame in both of his feet. So David, he in this radical move, he calls for Mephibosheth. Bring him to me, grandson of Saul. I want to talk to him. His men go to Lodebar. They bring him back into the palace. And Mephibosheth, he's terrified, it says. And he says, what do you want with a dead dog like me? David, I'm nothing. Just ignore me, please. I'm expecting you to execute me. That's what he's waiting for. That's why it says he's terrified. He thought that David was going to take revenge. Why? Because Mephibosheth knew the politics of those days. He knew how it worked back then. And how did it work? Well, just think of our own political climate. Commentators are saying this is one of the most brutal, divisive election cycles ever, and a ton of people are tense about what's going on. And it's true. However, that was nothing compared to how things worked in the ancient world. If you had a political rival, you wouldn't just trash them on Twitter you would kill them. So that was the way they did things. In fact, we know this from archaeology and tons of examples. Here's a few. 1 Kings 15, you have King Baasha, King Zimri, Jehu. You look outside of Scripture to the regicides of medieval Europe, and so you'd have these kings or queens, and what's the first thing they do? Kill off those who were there before. Look at what's happening in Turkey right now. A couple weeks ago, an attempted coup, and the Prime Minister, Erdogan, he is now arresting those who he thinks were a part of this coup, and so there's a ton of fear right now. Thousands and thousands of people are being imprisoned. Some are talking about execution, and so there is this climate of, okay, what's he going to do with his enemies? And for thousands of years, the political philosophy was solidification through liquidation. So purge the old regime in order to establish the new. Mephibosheth wasn't dumb. He knew how politics worked. He knew, oh no, David wants to see me. He sent his men to get me. He thinks, I'm going to die. What do you want, he says, with a dead dog such as I? He bows before him. But notice, David blows his mind, and he says, verse 7, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. I'm not going to do what you think is about to happen. Fear not. I will show you kindness. I'll restore to you, all the land that your grandpa Saul had? He was a rich man, tons of territory. I'm going to give all of that back to you. You're going to eat at my table. And I love verse 13. For the rest of his life, he ate in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the antithesis of Lo-Debar. Jerusalem was a capital city. It was the city of the king, luxury, beauty. Jerusalem means city of peace. From now on, you are going to sit at my table. From now on, you are a resident of my home. From now on, you are one of my sons. One of the challenges of teaching through Scripture, and I think in particular of the Old Testament, and some of these stories that you find, and we try and understand it. We try and translate it 3,000 years later. This was 3,000 years ago. And it's hard for us to really capture the gravitas, the weight of this moment. If you were there back when David had this conversation, if you were a fly on the wall, if you were listening, if you were observing, if you knew that culture, this was shocking. This was scandalous. This was unheard of. Who would reach out to a political opponent and love him and serve him and care for him? Who would forgive the guy who's a descendant of your worst enemy? I mean, check out what he does. Everything about it is countercultural. Number one, he reaches out to someone with disabilities. Again, in that culture, that never happened, especially in the surrounding cultures. That meant you were cursed by the gods. David, that wasn't his perspective. He reaches out to this guy. He loves him. He serves him. Number two, gives him back all the land that belonged to his grandpa. Number three, provided for all of his needs. This wasn't just a one-time gift. This was, for the rest of your life, I'm going to care for you. For the rest of your life, I'm going to provide for you. Number four, forgave a political enemy. Just imagine this afternoon, Hillary gives a speech. And let's say in her speech, she's like, I've had a change of heart. All the stuff I've been saying about Trump, my bad. I was wrong. Trump's actually a really sweet guy. We hang out together. We do CrossFit together. You should think about voting for him. That's never going to happen, right? So you can imagine the kind of shock here as those watching David. He did what? He said what? He's showing grace to that guy. Counter-cultural, subversive, radical. Live with me in Jerusalem. He goes in a moment from being a dead dog to the top dog. He goes from being a guy living in nowhere to now the capital city. He ate at the table. He was a son of the king. And the question that you have to be wrestling with right now, because I was wrestling with this all week. Why? why would David do this? This to me is one of the most beautiful examples of grace and love in David's story. And by the way, we all know this. David wasn't always the most loving guy. Next week, David and Bathsheba, as we'll see. But this is one example of him doing something so beautiful and so close to the heart of God. And I wondered as I'm reading this, and the weight culturally, the weight politically, the weight just theologically began to press on me. Whoa, this is so huge. Why would David do this? I know some of you're wrestling with that. And there's a couple words I want to share with you before we go today. 2 words. The first is this: promise. The very first reason why David reached out to Mephibosheth was because of a promise that he had made. And you may wish to write down 1 Samuel chapter 20, because we see there the origin of this covenant. David, one of the deep ironies of his life is that Saul hated him. Saul was his enemy. Saul tried to kill him, pin him to the wall. But Saul's son, Jonathan, was his best friend. This is one of the deep ironies of the whole story. And in 1 Samuel chapter 20, David and Jonathan, they're having this powwow. They're talking. They're sharing their hearts with each other. And David makes a solemn oath to Jonathan. And he says, I promise you, no matter what this looks like 10 years from now, 20 years from now, no matter what path we go politically, socially, financially, whatever, I will show kindness to you and to your descendants. He makes a promise. It's 25 years later. Jonathan was dead. Saul was dead. And yet David was a man of his word, and he said, I will fulfill the vow that I gave to Jonathan. I will do what I said that I would do. And the reason this strikes me is because we live in a culture where commitment is a 4-letter word. We shrink from the idea of making this kind of radical oath and love and loyalty to someone. In fact, last week, a couple days ago, I was reading a sociologist, and she was talking about how we treat relationships in the 21st century and how kind of that's different from different cultures in the world, and particularly in our own nation, whether it's a marriage or a friendship, even the church. And she was saying how we treat people kind of the same way we treat retail, or just think of going to Washington Square or whatever, where people and relationships and churches and marriages are, in our mind, goods to be consumed rather than people to be loved. We're disposable. They're disposable. If you make me happy, I'll be committed to you. If you don't make me happy, then I won't be committed to you any longer, and I'll move on. And technology, which in some ways has brought us closer together, and we're all connected now and have tons of so-called friends or whatever. But in some ways, it's accelerated and amplified the lack of depth that we have in relationships, because if there's someone you no longer like, well, what do? Just a simple click, unfriend, and then you move on. And she was saying how we carry this into every level of society, and it's compounded this where, here's the irony, we're more connected, but we're also more insecure. We have more friends, but we're also more lonely. And a lot of research has been done on that, how we're the most lonely generation of all time. Everyone's just having this haunting sense of exile right now, more insecure, and there's this cycle now because of that we're even more afraid to commit to someone or commit to a community. Now, true community is costly. True community, it will cost you financially, socially, politically. It will limit your time. It will limit your freedom. It'll limit your resources. Think of what this did for David. This limited him financially. There was a big price he had to pay. This limited him in what he could do. This limited him in the eyes of others. But he did it anyway because David understood the power of promise. Let your yes be yes, and your no be no. Who are the people that God has brought in your life? What would it look like for you to be committed in a culture that cultivates selfishness and shallow commitment? We are called to be a people of covenant faithfulness. And through that, just to show the faithfulness and the beauty of God. I'm so thankful that God doesn't commit to us the same way we commit to others. I am so thankful that God is relentless in his pursuit of us. I'm so thankful that God loves us and keeps his promises towards us. And this brings me to the second point. David, why would you do such a thing when all the pressure was on you to do something different? Number one, he would say, I made a promise, and I'm going to stay true to that promise no matter the cost. Number two, and this word is so rich, it's the word hesed. And hesed, it's the word kindness in our text. In fact, look at verse 7. David says to Mephibosheth, don't be afraid. Again, Mephibosheth is literally, in the Hebrew, he's shaking with terror. He's shaking with fear. He knows what could happen to him. Don't be afraid. I will show you kindness. And the Hebrew there is hesed. It means goodness, loyalty, or love. One commentator I was reading earlier, he defined hesed as being captured by love, being pulled in by love, being overwhelmed by love. The idea of hesed is that something has happened to rescue you when you didn't deserve to be rescued. You guys seen the news this morning? There was a guy called Luke Aiken who he jumped, you see this, CNN, jumped out of a plane 25,000 feet without a parachute on purpose. He's like an extreme sports guy. He jumps out 25,000 feet and he lives to tell the story. And there was 100-foot by 100-foot net that he fell into. So as he's falling, he has to kind of position himself and try and angle in such a way where he lands in this net, 25,000 feet. So he was asked the question, why? And his response was classic. He said, well, a lot of people would think that I'm crazy for doing such a thing. I don't know why they would think that, by the way. And he says, for me, this is just the next logical step of being an extreme sports guy. Wow. So here's a guy, 25,000 feet, no parachute, captured by something. Chesed is something like that. Chesed means you're falling. Chesed means you're crazy and you probably deserve to die. Chesed means that we've all messed up our life and we've jumped out of the plane. Chesed means that we were far from God, but God captured us. The gospel is the net that wrapped around our life, rescuing us. And David taps into this beautiful theological description of God. In fact, did you know chesed is found 250 times in the Bible, and every single time you see there beautiful analogies and poetry and description of God's heart. Of all the characteristics of God, chesed is at the top of the list. So what's the point? Here's the point. The reason that David could show chesed, kindness to Mephibosheth, is because David was after God's heart. In other words, he was pursuing God. And the more that he learned about God's heart, the more he saw the lavish, reckless, beautiful love of God, the more that his heart was changed by that. And now he looks for an opportunity to show that to others. This is found all throughout Scripture. A couple verses to write down. Here's one in Leviticus chapter 19. Some of you are so excited because Leviticus is your favorite book in all the Bible. Check this out. Leviticus 19 says, do not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block in front of the blind, but fear your God. I am the Lord. And do not pervert justice, and do not show favoritism to the great. Show respect for the elderly. When a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself. Isaiah chapter 1 says, help those who are oppressed. Give orphans their rights. Defend widows. Isaiah chapter 61, one of my favorite verses. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has chosen me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to set free the oppressed. By the way, that is the same verse that Jesus used in Luke 4 when he began his ministry. His very first sermon, he said, this is my mission statement. This is what I'm all about right here. The Spirit of God is on me, and I'm going to bring good news to the poor. I'm going to open the eyes of the blind. I'm going to set people who are oppressed free. Brothers and sisters, culture, it perpetuates this concept, this idea of intolerance. How? By focusing on our differences. Culture perpetuates intolerance by focusing on our differences, financially, racially, politically, socially. But Jesus abolished those walls with the radical insistence that we are all children of God. That's good news. That's why I love church. That's why I love hanging out with y'all. Because we can come here, different backgrounds, different stories, different views, different politics, all of that stuff. We can lay it down and we can worship together of one heart because we're rescued. We have the same faith, the same Father, the same future in him. So Jesus, he's about this. God has said it bends to the hurting, the broken, the outcast, the marginalized, the unemployed, the disabled, the disillusioned, the discouraged, the depressed. God has said is for the Mephibosheths of the world. Philip Yancey, he said this, I have come to know a God who has a soft spot for rebels, who recruits people like the whiner Jeremiah. Check out Jeremiah 1. The traitor Peter, the human rights abuser Saul of Tarsus. I have come to know a God whose son made prodigals the heroes of his story and the trophies of his ministry. Isn't that beautiful? And see, that's the gospel. That's why we're here. We were the prodigal. We were the rebel. We were the Mephibosheth. And God rescued us, and he saved us, and he called us by name. And that is why David loved this guy, because he got the heart of God. And the closer we get to the heart of God, the more we will have love for the Mephibosheths of our city and our world. And this brings me to the final question I want to ask you today. Who is your Mephibosheth? Do you know, every single one of us, we have Mephibosheths in our life. Right now, just open your heart to what God's Spirit would want to say to you. Because I think across this room, he's going to put people in your heart. He's going to bring people to mind. That person who, like Mephibosheth, they were dropped as a kid. They have scars and wounds and all kinds of baggage. Who's that person for you? Who's the person in your life who's the rebel, the prodigal? Who's the person in your life who is hurting or doesn't get the heart of God or who is separate from God? Who is that person, coworker, spouse, son, daughter, roommate? What would it look like for you, like David, to love them with this kind of radical, generous, giving, loving, serving chesed? What would that look like for you? And I know this can seem like an overwhelming question, but it could be as simple as what David did. And what did he do? He invited him to the table. Who's the person in your life that you can say, hey, let's meet for dinner? After work, come on over this week. Let's go grab coffee. Not because I have some agenda, not because I'm trying to do something in you. No, I have a genuine interest for you, and I want to be with you. There can be no reconciliation without incarnation. The problem is that many people talk about reconciliation, but they're not willing to take the step and actually be in someone's life. They're not willing to invest in that person. You can't just be for someone, you need to be with someone. Who's the person that God is calling you to be with? I have a friend, he has a heart for racial reconciliation, but rather, and this is a huge issue in our country right now, but rather than just tweet about it or post about it, he actually says, I want to do something about this, and I want to be the love of Jesus in these hurting, broken communities. And so he and his family actually moved into the inner city and are there just loving, serving, and learning from that community so that there can be true unity. What would it look like for us to pursue reconciliation with that person that maybe you're estranged from, that person who you have every reason to hate or ignore or despise? What would it look like for you, that person who wronged you or said something about you or who gossiped about you? The Mephibosheth, who is that person for you? And I love this church because it is filled with men and women who are doing just that. You're doing it in simple, beautiful ways. There's a team right now who's going to Nicaragua, and they're going to be there serving, loving. That is their way to pursue chesed, to live out this story. There's another team who right now, they just arrived a couple days ago. They're in Zimbabwe, and my wife's a part of that team, and they'll be gone for a few weeks. So I'm home with Amelia. She's 11, and we're getting used to Five Guys hamburgers because I'm the worst cook in the world. But she texted me on the way to church today, and she said, oh my goodness, this team is so amazing. And the love they have and the heart they have for these orphans is just so incredible to see. Missional communities in our church that have a heart for foster care and have a heart for kids who were dropped, who were abandoned. I had dinner with a couple recently, and this is what's burning in their heart: reconciliation with children who have been hurt or wronged or abused. And so they already have 3 kids of their own, and this year they've taken in 5 foster care kids. And so I'm there having dinner with them, and it was chaos. There's kids everywhere and shouting and yelling, chaos, but beautiful. Because reconciliation is so beautiful. Who is the Mephibosheth for you? There's another missional community in our church. It's all college students, 18, 19, 20 years old. And they heard about someone, a part of our community, who's struggling deeply financially, who their car fell apart and they needed it to get to work. And this is one of those situations where there's no resurrection story to this car. That bridge has been burned. There's no way for it to revive. And so this person, like, I don't know what to do. I have no money, no car. This missional community made up of college students. They said, we don't think Jesus is happy with that, so we're going to do something about it. So they all get together and they start pooling their resources. They then go to someone in our church who works for a car dealership, and they say, we know this family, this couple who they don't have any money and their car broke down, and we're a bunch of college students, and we pooled our resources, and the guy's like, how much do you have? $23. It was a little more than that, but not much. And what can we get? What can we do? And he said, well, let me see what I can do. And he goes back into his office, and he comes back, and he says, I'm going to kick in the rest. And they were able to get this family a car. How beautiful is that? You see, these are simple and Jesus-like ways to love the Mephibosheth. Now, I know I'm talking about these things like orphanage and talk about foster care and helping someone with a car. Okay, let's make it even more simple. Last gathering, during the 4 minutes, there was someone here who during the it's so easy, at least for me, during the 4 minutes to check out or go grab a cup of coffee or just be in my own world, especially if you're an introvert like me. This is like your time to seclude and get away. But he's like, I'm going to make it my goal every 4 minutes, I want to reach out to someone new. And so he does that. This is last gathering. Reaches out to someone. What's your name? Starts to hear their story. He's part of the military, and he brought his sister very first time. She'd been to church here, very first time. And there was just, in that short 4 minutes, some of their story starts coming out, and it's like really, really sad. And I then get up, give the message, and we open up the waters for baptism. Guess who's first in line? The brother and sister, and they give their life to Jesus. And here's a guy who he's able to cross that bridge, and through just being friendly and loving, walls go down. That is why I'm so passionate as a church that we would be a loving community, because people will come in here from all walks of life and all kinds of baggage. And if we're not loving them, and if we're not making them feel welcomed and at home in this place, the walls will still be there. But if you just reach out, a simple hug, simple handshake, simple, how are you? Let's go grab coffee or whatever. Are you part of a missional community? No, let me help you. And we do that, and the walls go down, and it makes my job a whole lot easier. Because I get up here, and I just start teaching and start sharing, and there's this direct line. There's this direct line from God's heart to their heart because the walls have already come down. Who is your Mephibosheth? What if that Mephibosheth is sitting right next to you or right behind you? What would it look like for you this week to reach out to them? Finally, have you received this kind of love in your life? It's Baptism Sunday. And I think it's very possible there are some in here, and we talk about this story of a guy who's estranged, who doesn't know the king, who feels like the dead dog. Is there anyone here, you feel like the dead dog before God? You have this perception of God that, oh, he's angry at me, and he's somewhere in his palace, and I'm just out in Lo-Debar somewhere, and I don't really have a relationship with him. No, you need to know, this isn't just about David. This is more importantly about the Son of David, Jesus, who pursued you and loved you, because we all have our stories of being broken. Some of us were dropped as a kid. Some of us, we walk with a limp because of what happened. Some of us, we have guilt and shame and brokenness from our past. But the good news is that the Son of David, he came after us. Do you know the name Mephibosheth? I found this out a couple days ago. Absolutely blew my mind, and my heart. Mephibosheth comes from two Hebrew words, pa'ah and boshet. Pa'ah means to bring to an end, kind of like this sermon in a few minutes. Boshet means shame or disgrace. I had never seen this before until Thursday. I'm reading this, oh my goodness. Mephibosheth means the end of disgrace. Mephibosheth means shame no more. Because of Jesus, brothers and sisters, shame no more. Because of Jesus, you are loved. Mephibosheth didn't have what it took to get to the king's palace. He was crippled. He needed help. Religion says you're crippled, try and get to God, but good luck with that. Do this, do that, follow these rules, follow these regulations, drink more green smoothies, whatever. That's religion. And the problem with religion is we say, I can't. I'm crippled. I'm broken. I have this nature inside of me. I can't get to God no matter how hard I try. That's religion. Christianity is the other way around. Christianity is about a king who came to us. They came to Mephibosheth in Lo-Debar. They tracked him down and they carried him to the city of peace. And that is what Jesus has done for you. That is the heart of the good news. He has carried you to his peace. He has brought you to his grace when we had no ability in and of ourselves to pursue him or love him. He pursued us. Some of us ran from God, but God ran faster. And he caught up with us and he saved us. And he says, you now are in my house. And you're no longer an outsider. You're no longer an enemy. You're my son and you're my daughter, and you will always be with me, and I have brought you to my table. And when Mephibosheth came to the table of the king, the table literally covered his brokenness. And when we come to the table of our King Jesus, he has covered your brokenness. He has covered and cleansed your past. He has set you free from the guilt, shame, no more. And is there anyone here today, and you're ready to receive that love? He stands at the door of your heart and he knocks. You've been carrying the guilt. You've been carrying the shame. Even into this room, you're like, I'm the dead dog. God says, no, you're my son. You're my daughter. Come and drink of the water I give you. Come and be set free. Come and let me liberate you. A friend of mine told me a story about a 4-year-old girl. She was learning the Lord's Prayer, but like kids can do, she learned it kind of wrong. And they're sitting together at night and they're praying. And the little girl says, Daddy, I want to pray the Lord's Prayer. And she closes her eyes and she folds her hands. She said, Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come, your will be done. And forgive us our trash baskets as we forgive those who put trash in our baskets. And the dad, he's like, Dom, I was about to correct her. That's not how it goes. And he's just about to say something. And then he thought, wait a minute. That's true. That's true. He's forgiven our trash baskets. Because of the gospel, he's taken out the trash. It's gone. And some of us, we keep going back and grabbing it, right? And he says, no, it's gone. It's nailed to the cross. You are set free. And today, if you have not received the gospel, if you've not received that kind of love, this is your moment right now. He has brought you here to this place, this safe space where all are welcome. Where all are welcome and none are turned away. He has brought you here to receive the ultimate gift of salvation in Jesus.